The autumn morning at Windsor Castle began like any other, with the changing of the guard ceremony drawing crowds of tourists who pressed against the iron gates, cameras ready to capture the iconic British tradition. Inside the castle walls, however, something unusual was unfolding that would soon shake the very foundations of royal protocol. Sergeant James Mitchell had served in the Queen's Guard for 12 years. A career built on discipline, silence, and unwavering adherence to centuries-old traditions. He stood at his post near the state apartments, his red tunic immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, his face an expressionless mask. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what was about to happen. Princess Charlotte, at 9 years old, had become a familiar presence around the castle. The young princess was known among the staff for her curious nature, and her habit of observing everything with those striking blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She often wandered the corridors with her nanny, asking questions about the paintings, the history, and the people who worked there. The guards had grown accustomed to her presence, though they never broke their stoic composure when she passed by. On this particular morning, Charlotte was supposed to be in her tutoring session, studying mathematics and French literature, but she had asked to use the restroom and, instead of returning directly to her lessons, had taken a detour through the castle's eastern wing. She told herself she was just stretching her legs, but truthfully, she was avoiding a particularly difficult algebra problem as she rounded the corner near the portrait gallery. She noticed something that made her pause. The door to the Queen Consort's private sitting room was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Camila was meticulous about her privacy, and the staff knew to keep her doors closed when she was in residence. Charlotte's curiosity got the better of her, and she slowed her pace. Listening, voices drifted through the opening, low and intense. Charlotte recognized her step-grandmother's voice immediately. But there was someone else there too, a man whose voice she didn't recognize. The conversation seemed urgent, almost heated. She caught fragments of sentences that made her young heart beat. "Faster," the man's voice said. "Something about the arrangements for the visit and ensuring no one interferes." Camila responded with words that Charlotte couldn't quite make out, but her tone was sharp, commanding. Then Charlotte heard something that made her blood run cold. The man mentioned the children and keeping them separated during the event. Charlotte felt a knot form in her stomach. Her instincts, honed by years of observing the complex dynamics of royal life, told her something was wrong. She had overheard enough conversations between adults to know when something was being hidden. When plans were being made that others weren't supposed to know about, she backed away from the door quietly, her mind racing. Who should she tell? Her father was away on official business in Scotland. Her mother was attending a charity event in London and wouldn't return until evening. Her grandfather, the king, was in meetings all morning, and she knew better than to interrupt him without a very good reason. As she walked through the corridors, trying to process what she had heard, she passed Sergeant Mitchell at his post. She had seen him many times before, and had even smiled at him once, receiving the tiniest hint of a twinkle in his eye in return. Though his face had remained perfectly still, there was something about him that made her feel safe. Perhaps the way he stood so solidly, so reliably, like a pillar that would never crumble. Charlotte continued walking, but her mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard. The more she thought about it, the more worried she became. She remembered a time months ago when she had heard her mother and father talking in hushed tones about being careful, about making sure she and her brothers were always supervised, about not trusting everyone in the household. At the time, she hadn't understood what they meant, but now those words took on a new significance. An hour later, as she sat through her tutoring session, barely able to concentrate on the French verb conjugations in front of her, Charlotte made a decision. She needed to tell someone, and it needed to be someone who could act quickly if necessary. But who could she trust? The staff members were loyal, but they answered to many people in the household. Her siblings were too young to understand. She felt terribly alone with this knowledge. When her lesson finally ended, Charlotte asked her nanny if she could take a walk in the gardens to clear her head. The nanny, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had been with the family for years, agreed, following at a respectful distance as Charlotte made her way outside. But Charlotte didn't head to the gardens. Instead, she turned down the corridor where she knew Sergeant Mitchell would still be standing at his post. As she approached, she tried to appear casual, but her hands were trembling slightly. She stopped a few feet away from him, pretending to examine a painting on the wall. A portrait of Queen Victoria that she had seen 1,000 times before. The sergeant remained perfectly still. His eyes fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanged. Charlotte took a deep breath. She knew that guards were trained never to speak, never to move, never to acknowledge anything happening around them unless it was a direct threat. But she also knew that beneath that uniform was a man who had sworn to protect the royal family. And right now she needed that protection. She moved closer to him, still pretending to look at the painting, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. Her words were careful, chosen with a wisdom beyond her years. She told him that something wasn't right, that she had heard something concerning about the Queen Consort's plans, and that she was worried about what might happen during the upcoming state visit that, weakened at Sergeant Mitchell's training, screamed at him to remain immobile, to ignore the child's words, to maintain his position. But something in the princess's voice, a genuine fear that he could hear despite her attempt to sound calm, made him hesitate. His eyes, the only part of him that could move without breaking protocol, flickered down to her for just a fraction of a second. Charlotte noticed that tiny movement and felt a surge of hope. She continued speaking, her voice still low, telling him about the conversation she'd overheard, about the mention of keeping the children separated, about the strange urgency in Camilla's voice. She mentioned that her parents were both away and that she didn't know who else to tell. Inside his mind, Sergeant Mitchell was facing an impossible choice. Everything in his training told him to remain silent, to report through proper channels after his shift, to never, under any circumstances, break protocol. But everything in his instincts, honed by years of service and a natural protective nature, told him that this child was genuinely frightened and that what she was saying might be important. He thought about the rumors that had circulated among the staff in recent months. Whispers about tensions in the household, about disagreements over the children's security arrangements, about Camilla's increasing attempts to control various aspects of palace operations. He had dismissed them as gossip, but now, hearing the princess's words, those whispers took on a more ominous tone. Charlotte watched the sergeant's face, searching for any sign that he had heard her, that he believed her, that he would help. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, in a movement so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, Sergeant Mitchell shifted his weight ever so slightly, a tiny adjustment that in the language of the guards meant acknowledgement. That small gesture gave Charlotte the courage to say one more thing. She told him that she had seen a man leaving Camilla's sitting room, someone she didn't recognize, someone who wasn't part of the regular staff. She described him, as best she could, tall, with dark hair graying at the temples, wearing an expensive suit, but not the kind worn by diplomats or government officials. This detail changed everything for Sergeant Mitchell. Unknown visitors to the Queen Consort's private chambers, especially ones who weren't logged with security, represented a serious breach of protocol. Combined with the princess's account of the conversation and her obvious distress, this was no longer something he could ignore. The sergeant made his decision in that moment. A decision that would end his career as he knew it, but might also prevent something terrible from happening. He did something that guards simply did not do. He turned his head, looked directly at Princess Charlotte, and in a voice low enough that only she could hear, he spoke a single word. He said her name, acknowledging her as a person, not just as part of the scenery he was trained to ignore. That single word, spoken by a guard who should have remained silent, set in motion a series of events that no one could have predicted. Princess Charlotte felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief that someone had finally listened to her. Sergeant Mitchell gestured with the slightest movement of his head toward a small alcove nearby. Away from the main corridor where they might be observed, Charlotte understood immediately and walked to the alcove, her nanny still following at a distance, but now looking confused by the princess's unusual behavior. The sergeant waited exactly 30 seconds, counting each one internally, before he did something unprecedented. He stepped away from his post. In 12 years of service, James Mitchell had never abandoned his position without being properly relieved. It was one of the most serious breaches a guard could commit, potentially resulting in immediate dismissal and the loss of all honors earned during service. But as he moved toward the alcove where the young princess waited, he knew that some things mattered more than tradition. He approached Charlotte and knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he could see that she was genuinely frightened, her usual confident demeanor replaced by the vulnerability of a child who had stumbled onto something dangerous. He kept his voice calm and steady, asking her to tell him everything again. Slowly, and with as much detail as she could remember, Charlotte repeated her story, this time including small details she had forgotten before. She mentioned that the man had been carrying a leather folder, the kind used for official documents. She remembered that Camila had called him by a first name, something like Marcus or Malcolm. Recalled hearing the word arrangements multiple times, and something about the German delegation which was scheduled to visit Windsor that weekend. The sergeant's concern deepened. The state visit from Germany was a major event, with high-level security protocols already in place. Any unauthorized planning or secret arrangements related to such a visit represented not just a protocol violation, potentially a security threat. He needed to report this immediately. But to whom? Going through normal channels would mean reporting to his commanding officer, who would report to the head of palace security, who might then report to the private secretary, and so on. By the time the information reached someone who could act on it, hours or even days might pass. Moreover, if the queen consort was indeed involved in something irregular, reporting through normal channels might alert her before the matter could be properly investigated. The sergeant realized he needed to go higher, directly to someone who had both the authority and the independence to act without political considerations. He made a decision that would have seemed impossible just an hour earlier. He told Princess Charlotte that he believed her, that he would make sure the right people knew about this, that she should return to her lessons and act as if nothing had happened. He emphasized that she should not mention their conversation to anyone, not even her nanny, until he could speak with the appropriate authorities. Charlotte nodded, feeling the weight lift slightly from her shoulders. As she walked away, the sergeant returned to his post, knowing that his next actions would define not just his career but possibly his entire life. He stood at attention for another hour, completing his shift as if nothing had happened, though his mind was racing with plans. When his replacement arrived, Sergeant Mitchell went through the formal changing of the guard procedure, then headed straight to the office of Commander William Hartley, the head of the Royal Protection Command. Commander Hartley was known as a man of absolute integrity, someone who had served multiple monarchs and who answered to no one except the security of the royal family itself. The commander looked up in surprise. When Sergeant Mitchell knocked on his door, guards at his level rarely had reason to seek a private audience with someone of Hartley's rank. But when Mitchell requested a confidential meeting regarding a potential security matter involving Princess Charlotte, Hartley immediately cleared his schedule and locked his office door. For the next hour, Sergeant Mitchell laid out everything he had learned, including his own breach of protocol in speaking with the princess and leaving his post. He expected immediate reprimand, possibly even arrest. But Commander Hartley listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Mitchell finished, Hartley sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. Then he did something unexpected. He thanked the sergeant for his courage and told him that he had done exactly the right thing. Protocol be damned. He picked up his secure phone and made a call, speaking in low tones to someone on the other end, using phrases like potential irregularity and requires immediate but discreet investigation. Within 2 hours, a quiet inquiry had begun. Commander Hartley personally reviewed the security logs for the Queen Consort's wing, checking for any unauthorized visitors. What he found was troubling. A visitor named Marcus Pemberton had been logged in 3 times over the past 2 weeks, each time listed as a private consultant, but with no specific purpose noted and no proper security clearance on. Filed further investigation revealed that Pemberton was a lawyer specializing in trust law and estate planning, with a client list that included several controversial figures involved in offshore holdings and complex financial arrangements. More disturbing was the discovery that he had connections to a security firm that had been investigated, though never charged, for conducting unauthorized surveillance operations. Commander Hartley brought this information to the king's private secretary, a man named Sir Geoffrey Morrison, who had served the royal family for 30 years and whose loyalty was beyond question. Sir Geoffrey listened with increasing alarm, particularly when he learned that Princess Charlotte had been the one to raise the initial concern. The two men faced a delicate situation. They needed to investigate further without alerting the queen consort if she was indeed involved in something inappropriate. They also needed to ensure the children's safety during the upcoming state visit, without causing a diplomatic incident or creating palace drama that might leak to the press. Sir Geoffrey decided to take a calculated risk. He arranged a private meeting with the king, who was scheduled to return from Scotland that evening. He prepared a comprehensive briefing document, including the security log irregularities, the information about Marcus Pemberton, and most importantly, the account from Princess Charlotte as relayed through Sergeant Mitchell. When the king returned and was briefed, his reaction was immediate and intense. Charles III had always been protective of his grandchildren, and the suggestion that they might be at risk, or that there might be unauthorized planning involving them, triggered both his parental instincts and his sense of duty as monarch. However, the king was also a man who had learned patience through decades of public service. He instructed Sir Geoffrey and Commander Hartley to continue their investigation quietly but thoroughly. He wanted to know exactly what Camila was planning, who Marcus Pemberton was working for, and what these arrangements for the state visit entailed. But he wanted this information gathered without confrontation, without accusations, and without tipping off anyone who might be involved. Meanwhile, Princess Charlotte went about her normal routine, attending lessons, having tea with her brothers, and playing in the castle gardens. But she found it difficult to concentrate, constantly wondering if Sergeant Mitchell had believed her, if anyone was doing anything about what she had told him, and most of all, whether she had imagined the danger or if something truly sinister was unfolding around her that evening. As she was getting ready for bed, her father called from Scotland. He spoke to her in his usual warm manner, asking about her day and her studies. But Charlotte detected something different in his voice, careful attention to her responses, as if he was listening for something beyond her words. She wondered if he knew, if someone had told him. But she followed Sergeant Mitchell's instructions and said nothing unusual. After she hung up, Prince William sat in his hotel room in Edinburgh, staring at his phone. He had received a secure message from his father outlining the situation. The message had been brief but clear. There was a potential security concern involving his daughter and the Queen Consort, and he needed to return to Windsor immediately, but discreetly, without alerting the press or changing his official schedule in any way that might raise questions. Back at Windsor, investigation was intensifying. Commander Hartley had assigned his most trusted operatives to watch the Queen Consort's movements and communications. They discovered that she had scheduled an unusual private meeting for the day before the German state visit, a meeting with several people whose names did not appear on any official palace roster. More troubling still was the discovery that Camila had requested specific changes to the security arrangements for the state visit, changes that would have resulted in the Cambridge children being taken to a separate location during the main event, ostensibly for their safety, but using guards who were not part of their regular protection detail, DFSA. The pieces were starting to form a picture, though not yet a complete one. It appeared that Camila, possibly advised by Marcus Pemberton, was attempting to arrange some kind of separate event or meeting involving the children, something that would happen outside the normal security protocols and without the knowledge or consent of their parents. The question that haunted everyone involved was why. What could the Queen Consort possibly gain from such arrangements? Was this simply an overstep by someone trying to assert authority over the household, or was there something more calculated, more dangerous at play? As Friday night fell over Windsor Castle, multiple investigations were running in parallel, security teams reviewing protocols, financial experts examining Pemberton's background, and palace officials quietly interviewing staff members who might have seen or heard something relevant. And at the center of it all was a 9-year-old girl who had trusted her instincts and a guard who had broken protocol to protect her. Saturday morning arrived with typical British weather, gray clouds threatening rain but holding off, as if even nature was waiting to see how events would unfold. The German delegation was scheduled to arrive at noon, and Windsor Castle buzzed with final preparations. Staff members polished silver, arranged flowers, and reviewed ceremonial protocols that had been rehearsed dozens of times. But beneath this surface of normalcy, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Commander Hartley had positioned his most experienced officers at key locations throughout the castle. They appeared to be part of the normal security detail, but each had been briefed on the situation and given specific instructions to observe and report any unusual activities, particularly those involving the Queen Consort or unknown individuals. Prince William had returned from Scotland late Friday night. Entering through a private entrance to avoid media attention, he immediately met with his father, Commander Hartley, and Sir Geoffrey Morrison in the King's private study. The meeting lasted until past midnight, with voices occasionally rising in intensity as they discussed what they had learned and what actions they should take. The investigation into Marcus Pemberton had revealed connections that were deeply concerning. The lawyer had been retained not just by the Queen Consort personally, but by a private foundation that appeared to be linked to several European families with historical claims to various royal privileges. While these claims had no legal standing, the families had been known to engage in complex legal maneuvers, attempting to gain influence or financial advantage through their distant royal connections. More disturbing was the discovery that Pemberton had been researching guardianship laws, specifically provisions that might allow for temporary custody arrangements for minor royals under certain circumstances. The research appeared to focus on historical precedents, where royal children had been placed under the care of senior royals other than their parents during times of crisis or diplomatic necessity. The implications were chilling. It appeared that someone, possibly with Camilla's involvement or manipulation, was laying groundwork for a legal argument that could separate the Cambridge children from their parents, even if only temporarily. The state visit provided an opportunity, with both William and Catherine scheduled to be occupied with official duties, leaving a window where the children might be more vulnerable to such maneuvering. The king was outraged, but controlled his emotions with the discipline of someone who had spent a lifetime in the public eye. He made a decision that was both bold and necessary. The state visit would proceed as planned, but with modifications to the security protocols that would ensure the children remained under the direct supervision of their parents or trusted protection officers at all times. Additionally, he ordered that Camilla's movements be monitored throughout the day, and that Marcus Pemberton be denied access to the castle grounds under any pretext. Early Saturday morning, before the rest of the household was awake, Princess Charlotte was gently woken by her mother. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been briefed on everything that had happened, and she needed to speak with her daughter privately. They walked together to a small sitting room that Charlotte loved, a cozy space with windows overlooking the gardens where morning light was just beginning to break through the clouds. Catherine sat beside her daughter and took her hands. She told Charlotte that she had done something incredibly brave and important by speaking to Sergeant Mitchell. She explained in terms that a 9-year-old could understand, that sometimes adults make plans that aren't in everyone's best interest, and that Charlotte's instincts had been absolutely correct to sense that something was wrong. Charlotte felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that she had been right to speak up, but fear about what all of this meant. She asked her mother if they were in danger, if Camilla had been trying to hurt them. Catherine carefully explained that it wasn't quite that simple, that sometimes people do things they think are right, but which might harm others, and that the important thing was that the problem had been caught early, before anything bad could happen. As they talked, Charlotte revealed something she hadn't mentioned to Sergeant Mitchell. She had seen the man, Marcus Pemberton, on one other occasion, leaving the castle late one evening about a week earlier. She had been unable to sleep and had gone to the library to find a book when she saw him being escorted out by one of Camilla's personal assistants? They had been speaking in hushed tones, and she had heard Pemberton say something about the documents being almost ready, and everything will be in place by next weekend. This new information added another piece to the puzzle. Catherine immediately relayed it to William, who informed Commander Hartley. The security chief now had confirmation that whatever was being planned had been in preparation for at least a week, possibly longer, and involved formal documentation of some kind. A decision was made to confront Camila before the German delegation arrived, to give her an opportunity to explain her actions and to make clear that any unauthorized plans involving the children would not be tolerated. The king would conduct the meeting personally, with Sir Geoffrey and Commander Hartley present as witnesses. At 10 o'clock, Camila was summoned to the king's private study. She arrived expecting a routine pre-event briefing, perhaps some last-minute adjustments to the day's schedule. Instead, she found her husband seated behind his desk, with an expression she had rarely seen, one of cold, controlled anger. Sir Geoffrey and Commander Hartley stood nearby, their presence making it clear this was not a casual conversation. The king began by asking Camila directly about Marcus Pemberton. She hesitated, surprise flickering across her face before she composed herself. She explained that Pemberton was a lawyer she had consulted regarding some personal financial matters, nothing that concerned the family or the state. When asked why he had visited the castle multiple times without proper security clearance, she claimed it had been an oversight by her staff, that she hadn't realized the proper procedures hadn't been followed. But when the king mentioned the research into guardianship laws and the proposed changes to the security arrangements for the state visit, Camila's composure began to crack. She insisted that she had only been trying to help, that she thought it would be beneficial for the children to have a separate, more elaborate program during the formal diplomatic events. She claimed that William and Catherine had been overprotective, and that as queen consort, she had both the right and the responsibility. To ensure proper protocol was followed, the king listened to these explanations with increasing skepticism. He pointed out that any changes to security arrangements for his grandchildren should have been discussed with their parents first, not arranged secretly with outside consultants. He noted that proper procedure had been violated multiple times, and that the involvement of someone like Pemberton, with his specific legal expertise, suggested this was about more than simply arranging a children's program. Pressed further, Camila finally admitted to a more ambitious plan. She revealed that she had been concerned about what she called the excessive influence of the Middleton family over the Cambridge children. She felt that, as queen consort, she should have a more significant role in their upbringing and education, particularly in matters of royal protocol and duty. The plan had been to establish a legal framework that would give her formal advisory status over the children's schedules and activities, something that would have required the parents' consent, but which she hoped to present to them as a fait accompli. Already approved by palace officials, the room fell silent as everyone absorbed this admission. What Camila was describing was an attempt to insert herself into the parental authority structure of the Cambridge family, to create a legal mechanism that would give her say over decisions about the children's lives. While she protested that her intentions had been good, that she only wanted to ensure the children were properly prepared for their future roles, the others in the room saw it for what it was: an overreach of authority bordering on a power grab. The king's response was measured but firm. He told Camila that her concerns about the children's upbringing should have been expressed directly to their parents, not pursued through secretive legal arrangements. He informed her that Marcus Pemberton would no longer be granted access to the castle or any royal residence, and that any future consultants or advisors she wished to engage must be properly vetted through palace security. More significantly, he made it clear that she had no formal authority over his grandchildren, that their parents alone had the right to make decisions about their upbringing, and that any future attempts to circumvent that authority would have serious consequences. While he stopped short of explicit threats, the implication was clear. Her position as queen consort could be made increasingly ceremonial if she could not respect boundaries. Camila left the meeting shaken and angry, feeling that she had been ambushed and that her motives had been mischaracterized. She retreated to her private apartments, where she spent the next hour in phone calls with advisors and friends, presenting herself as the victim of a campaign orchestrated by those who had never fully accepted her role in the family. Meanwhile, preparations continued for the state visit. The German chancellor and her delegation arrived promptly at noon, and the formal ceremonies proceeded without incident. The Cambridge children were present for the arrival ceremony, standing with their parents and grandparents as the visitors were welcomed. To outside observers, everything appeared normal, the perfect image of royal unity and tradition. But those who knew what had transpired in the preceding days could see subtle differences. Camilla stood slightly apart from the others, her smile fixed and formal. The king's interactions with her were correct, but noticeably cooler than usual. William and Catherine kept their children close, and several additional protection officers could be seen positioned at strategic points, more than would normally be assigned for an event of this nature. Princess Charlotte, standing between her parents, looked up at her father at one point and caught his eye. He gave her a small nod and the briefest of smiles, acknowledgement that she had done the right thing, that her courage had protected her family. She thought about Sergeant Mitchell, who she had seen earlier that morning standing at his post as always, his face expressionless, but his eyes warm when they briefly met hers. The state visit continued through the afternoon and evening, with formal dinners and discussions of diplomatic matters. On the surface, everything proceeded perfectly, but beneath that surface, relationships within the royal family had shifted fundamentally. Trust had been broken, boundaries had been clarified, and a young princess had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between protocol and principle. The weeks following the German state visit brought changes to Windsor Castle that were subtle too, outsiders, but significant to those within the royal household. New protocols were established, creating clearer lines of authority regarding the Cambridge children and requiring that any proposed changes to their schedules or security arrangements be approved by their parents and the king himself. Additional oversight was added to the process of approving visitors and consultants for senior royals, ensuring that another Marcus Pemberton situation could not occur undetected. For Sergeant James Mitchell, the aftermath of his decision to break protocol proved to be unexpectedly complex. Commander Hartley had protected him from formal disciplinary action, citing the exceptional circumstances and the critical importance of the information he had helped bring forward. However, the incident could not be entirely ignored within the rigid structure of the Guard. Mitchell was quietly transferred to a different post. Technically, a lateral move, but one that kept him away from areas where he might encounter difficult choices between protocol and protection again. The sergeant accepted this outcome without complaint. He had known the potential consequences when he chose to speak with Princess Charlotte, and he had no regrets. On his final day at Windsor Castle, before transferring to his new assignment at the Tower of London, he stood at his familiar post one last time. As he maintained his silent vigil, Princess Charlotte happened to pass by with her nanny. Returning from a music lesson, she paused near him, not so close as to be obvious, but near enough that he could hear when she spoke softly, thanking him for listening to her, for believing her, for keeping her family safe. The sergeant, standing rigidly at attention, could not respond verbally, but his eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that glance she saw understanding, respect, and something like pride. It was a moment she would remember for the rest of her life. A lesson about courage and doing what is right, even when it costs you something important. For Princess Charlotte herself, experience had been transformative. She had learned that her instincts mattered, that speaking up about something wrong was not only acceptable, but necessary, and that sometimes the most important rules are the ones written in conscience rather than protocol books. Her parents had been careful to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms, making sure she understood that she had done nothing wrong and everything right, while also helping her process the complex emotions that came with realizing that not all adults had her best interests at heart. Catherine and William had long conversations with their daughter about trust, about discernment, and about the difference between being suspicious of everyone and being appropriately cautious about unusual situations. They praised her for her bravery and her wisdom in choosing to speak to someone in authority, rather than trying to handle the situation herself or simply ignoring her concerns. They made sure she understood that the household staff, the protection officers, and most of all her parents would always be there to listen and to help if she ever felt worried or unsafe again. The relationship between Camilla and the rest of the family had entered a new phase, one marked by formal correctness but underlying tension. The king had made it clear in private conversations with his wife that he would not tolerate any more attempts to assert authority over his grandchildren, or to circumvent the proper channels of family communication. Camilla, wounded by what she perceived as a rebuke and embarrassed by the exposure of her plans, retreated somewhat from family matters. Focusing more on her own charitable initiatives and public duties, there were moments of awkwardness at family gatherings. Occasions when the carefully maintained public facade of unity felt particularly fragile. But the family was nothing if not experienced in maintaining appearances, and to the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. The British press occasionally noted that Camilla seemed to be less involved with the Cambridge children than they had expected when she became Queen Consort, but they attributed this to the children's busy schedules and the demands of everyone's public duties. Marcus Pemberton, the lawyer whose involvement had catalyzed the crisis, found his services to the royal household permanently terminated. The palace's legal team conducted a thorough review of all documents he had prepared and all advice he had given, ensuring that no legal frameworks had been established that might later create complications. Pemberton attempted to salvage his reputation by claiming he had simply been following his client's instructions, but word spread quietly through London's elite legal circles about his involvement in the Windsor incident, and his practice suffered accordingly. Commander Hartley implemented several changes to palace security procedures based on lessons learned from the incident. New protocols required more rigorous vetting of personal consultants engaged by senior royals, even for ostensibly private matters. Communication channels were established to ensure that any concerns raised by protection officers or household staff about irregular activities would be reviewed promptly by appropriate authorities. And perhaps most significantly, the culture of absolute silence among the guards was quietly modified to acknowledge that their duty to protect the royal family might, in rare circumstances, require them to speak rather than remain silent. As autumn turned to winter, life at Windsor Castle settled into a new normal. The Cambridge children continued their education, their activities. They're growing into their roles as future members of the royal family. Charlotte excelled in her studies, showing particular aptitude for history and languages. But she also demonstrated a heightened awareness of the people around her, a tendency to observe carefully and to trust her instincts about situations and individuals. One cold December morning, several months after the incident, Charlotte was walking through the portrait gallery with her art tutor. Studying the paintings and discussing technique, they came upon the portrait of Queen Victoria that Charlotte had been pretending to examine on the day. She first spoke to Sergeant Mitchell. She paused there, remembering that moment of decision. That instant when she had chosen to trust her instincts and seek help rather than remain silent about her concerns. Her art tutor asked if something about the painting interested her, and Charlotte smiled, a wise smile that seemed beyond her years. She said that she was thinking about courage, about how the queens and kings in these portraits had to make difficult decisions, had to know when to follow tradition and when to break from it for the greater good. The tutor, not knowing the full context of Charlotte's thoughts, nevertheless recognized profundity in the young princess's observation and encouraged her to explore those themes in her studies. That evening, at a private family dinner attended only by the immediate family, without the formal protocol of a state event, Charlotte watched the adults around the table. Her grandfather, the king, was discussing plans for an upcoming tour of the Commonwealth. Her father and mother were listening attentively, occasionally offering suggestions. Camilla sat at the other end of the table, participating in the conversation, but with a certain reserve that had not been present before the incident. Charlotte understood, in the way that children who grow up in complex families learn to understand such things, that relationships had changed. That trust once broken is not easily rebuilt, but that families find ways to continue functioning even when perfect harmony is impossible. She saw that her parents were watchful, that her grandfather was protective in a way he might not have been before, and that Camilla had learned to respect boundaries she might have previously felt entitled to cross. Later that week, Charlotte received an unexpected letter, delivered through private channels rather than the normal palace mail system. It was from Sergeant Mitchell, carefully written, expressing his hope that she was well and his pride in her courage and wisdom. He told her that his new post at the Tower of London was interesting, filled with its own history and stories, and that he sometimes gave tours to visitors, including children who reminded him of her. He wrote that he hoped she would continue to trust her instincts, to speak up when something seemed wrong, and to never doubt that doing the right thing was always worth whatever cost it might carry. Charlotte kept that letter in a special box in her room, along with other meaningful treasures. She wrote back a careful letter appropriate for a princess to send to a former guard, thanking him for his service and expressing her wish that he was happy in his new position. But she also included a line that only the two of them would fully understand. She wrote that she was grateful he had taught her that sometimes the most important duty is the one that isn't written in any rule book. As the year drew to a close, the royal family prepared for Christmas at Sandringham, the traditional gathering that would be watched by millions around the world. The official photographs showed the family in festive harmony, the king and queen, consort, the prince and princess of Wales with their children, all smiling for the cameras. And perhaps those smiles were a bit more measured, a bit more carefully maintained than in previous years. But they were genuine nonetheless, the smiles of people who had weathered a storm and emerged stronger, more aware, more careful with the trust they placed and the bonds they maintained. Princess Charlotte stood in that Christmas photograph, positioned between her brothers, her hand held by her mother. She looked at the camera with the poise expected of a young royal. But those who knew her well, who understood what she had experienced, that autumn could see something else in her expression. There was a maturity there, a quiet confidence that came from having faced a difficult situation and handled it well. There was awareness that the world of palaces and protocols was more complex and sometimes more dangerous than it appeared, but also the understanding that courage and instinct and the willingness to speak truth could protect against those dangers. In the years that would follow, the incident at Windsor Castle would be discussed in private among those who knew about it, but never publicly acknowledged. It would become one of those stories that circulates quietly in the corridors of power, a reminder that protocol exists to serve people, not the other way around. And that sometimes the youngest voice in the room might be the one that needs to be heard most clearly. For Charlotte, it would be a defining moment in her journey toward whatever role she would ultimately play in the royal family. It taught her that being royal meant more than wearing crowns and attending ceremonies. It meant being vigilant, being brave, being willing to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. And it taught her that sometimes the people who protect you are not just the ones with official titles and positions, but anyone who chooses, in a moment of crisis, to listen to a worried child and to act on what they hear, regardless of what it might cost them personally. Sergeant James Mitchell, standing guard at the Tower of London on that Christmas day, probably did not see the royal family photograph when it was published, or if he did not study it closely. But he would have recognized if someone had pointed it out to him, that look in Princess Charlotte's eyes. He would have understood that she had learned the lesson he had tried to teach through his actions. That duty sometimes requires breaking the very rules that define it. And that true service means protecting not just the physical safety of those in your care, but their well-being, their agency, and their ability to speak truth to power when necessary. The story of a royal guard who cast aside all protocols when a princess urgently muttered a warning would never make headlines, would never be told in official histories, would never receive the recognition or attention that more public acts of service receive. But for those involved, it remained a pivotal moment. A reminder that in the carefully choreographed world of royalty, the most important moments are often the unscripted ones, the instances when human instinct and moral courage take precedence over tradition and protocol, and when a whispered warning is heard and acted upon. Regardless of who speaks it or what rules must be broken to respond appropriately,